So when we left our heroes, we were we had seen that this manuscript, the Leiden manuscript of the Yerushalmi, was in 1530 the only surviving complete manuscript, and that this was the physical manuscript that the printers used in preparing that first printing. It is the manuscript they're referring to when they said we have only been able to identify all across the rabbinic centers of Europe one complete manuscript. Here it is. It was put in a drawer and forgotten about for 400 years. This manuscript was written around 1300, and I think 12, maybe the 1280s. The copyist who made this manuscript in his Kalahana, in addition to noting the dates and whatnot of his completion of the manuscript, says, and this is the piece that one has to get one's head around. He says, I have traveled around to numerous rabbinic centers around Europe. This is in the 1280s. And wherever I go, no one has a copy of the Yerushalmi. I was able to locate only one complete manuscript of the Talmud Yerushalmi, along with some scattered snippets. That is what I have copied. It is full of errors. It is full of problems. There are sections missing, but I don't have any way of recovering them because one simply cannot find the Yerushalmi. Now, this is a much more shocking statement because we have Rishonim all around from this period who quote the Yerushalmi, who talk about the Yerushalmi. I don't have to. Now, so we know that the Rif in Spain quotes the Yerushalmi. There are a couple Balei Tosfot in France, up in northern France, who quote the Yerushalmi. There are scholars in Italy who quote the Yerushalmi. There is no longer by the 11th century. There's no longer a community in Kairouan. Kairouan had been destroyed, but the knowledge of the Yerushalmi that had begun with Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nisim in Kairouan, and apparently their teacher, we assume, the author of Sefer Mitivot, right, who really originated this renewed interest in Yerushalmi, had spread. How could it be that there weren't copies of the Yerushalmi all around when there was so much interest in it? When you look at those Rishonim who talk about the Yerushalmi, you notice something interesting. Repeatedly, they will write things like, when I was able to briefly consult a copy of the Yerushalmi, I found, or I believe this is what's said in the Yerushalmi, but I don't have access to a copy here in city X, so I can't be sure. And variations on that theme. In other words, the first thing is that all of these Rishonim who are interested in studying, talking about the Yerushalmi, they don't have copies of it. Why would that be? Well, the reason, essentially, is that manuscript copying is very expensive. It takes a long time. Think about the investment that a synagogue needs to make if it wants to commission a new Sefer Torah, because that Sefer Torah has to be written by a specialist by hand and takes a minimum of 8 to 10 months if the person is working on it full time. So the Talmud is much longer. Copying it is a major endeavor. And therefore, and even more more difficult as you go further back in time in various ways. So a rabbinic scholar in the 1100s, in the 1200s, even if they are very interested in the Yerushalmi, simply wouldn't, since it was not the main focus of study in their community, since that was still always the Bavli, they would not have had the means to commission their own copy of the Yerushalmi. There were some very small number of copies in existence that at certain times were brought from community to community. So you'll have a Rishon who will say that he had a brief opportunity to consult the Yerushalmi, or years ago when I had a copy of the Yerushalmi. So, and now why would there be, one of the reasons that there were so few seems to be that the original source of the energy and excitement and interest in study of the Yerushalmi really came from Kairouan. And while there would have been maybe a few copies that were made and sent to communities in Europe, the one place where you would have been certain to have complete and, to the extent possible, well-preserved copies of the Yerushalmi would have been Kairouan. But as I mentioned, Kairouan was destroyed in the 960s and 70s, as in the course of wars between warring Arab tribes. It was completely destroyed, and presumably, and this is one of the reasons. This, among other things, one of the reasons that while we have manuscripts of Jewish texts from back to the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in Europe, we have, for the discovery of the Cairo Geniza, we had 0 from the Arab world, because whereas in Europe, in Christian Europe, there was a culture of preserving even heretical books in monasteries, even if they were, the idea that they should be preserved even if they're not going to be read. And you had all of these monks who literally had nothing else to do and sat and copied. And often, although sometimes those monastery book repositories were burned or destroyed, often they were spared even when there was war raging around them. No such thing existed in the Arab world, and when a community was attacked, destroyed, pillaged, destroyed, everything was burned. And so we also don't have a real tradition of manuscript Arabic writings from this period, even though this is the end of what we've known as the Golden Age of Spain, right? Of Spain, of the Spanish sort of the Arab ruled Spanish community really flourishing, the Jews flourishing, and science and philosophy more generally flourishing there. We have a real dearth of manuscripts from that era because when places were destroyed, they were destroyed. So that means that when Kairouan was lost, there were precious few copies of the Yerushalmi remaining in existence. Most of whatever there would have been in Kairouan. In the same way that people would, before the Babylonian Talmud was started to be copied and sent out to other communities, what would happen is that people would travel to Babylonia, study with the Babylonian Gaonim, memorize the Talmud there, and then go back to their communities. Something like that seems to have happened with Kairouan and the Yerushalmi. And when Kairouan was lost, that resource was lost. And yet, for another 250 years or three after that, interest among at least some of the early medieval Rishonim in the Yerushalmi remained high. How and why is that? And how did they cultivate that engagement and interest when they didn't have a copy of the text to study? And so here's the second part of kind of Zussman's really eye-opening kind of realization. The first piece was that all of these Rishonim who talk about the Yerushalmi and are interested in it and try to explain it and whatnot, almost all of them give us evidence in their own writing that they did not have a copy of the Yerushalmi at hand to consult, that they consulted a Yerushalmi on on the rare occasions when the opportunity arose, when they had traveled to a place that had a copy, or when someone with a copy was traveling through their place. And that those sightings were few and far between. The second piece of his discovery was that it was already clear and well known that when later Rishonim from the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s talk about Yerushalmi Sugya, which they did with some frequency, they were only talking about Yerushalmi Sugyot that had been talked about by earlier Rishonim. In other words, they were the rabbis in the 1300s and 1400s were not studying or consulting the Talmud Yerushalmi independently. They were simply drawing on the citations of the Yerushalmi in early Rishonim. That is sort of across the board. But it turns out that even the discussions of and references to the Yerushalmi among this, in this earlier era of real, a much deeper interest in Yerushalmi, the vast majority of quotations of the Yerushalmi are also taken from earlier Rishonim. If you look at the Rishonim, sort of most well known for placing great import on the Yerushalmi and on reading the Yerushalmi alongside the Bavli, the Rif in 11th century Spain, the Ra'avad in 12th century Provence, Rabbi Yishai Trani in the early 13th century in Italy, and numerous others. The Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yakar, one of the Balei Tosfot, northern France. Almost every single Yerushalmi text that they refer to can be found in Rabbeinu Hananel, Rav Nissim Gaon, and especially the Sefer Mitivot. There are a couple of Ashkenaz Rishonim who seem to indicate that they did have regular opportunities, however regular, we don't know, but regular opportunities to consult an actual text of the Yerushalmi. And obviously we know, like, we have a manuscript of it. It did exist. And unlike in sort of later periods when the Leiden manuscript got sort of put into a closet and forgotten about, it existed, and presumably there were people who utilized it. The Or Zarua, one of the towering figures of the community in central Germany in the 13th century, he talks about consulting the Yerushalmi text, and he seems to have indeed had access to that text. But most of the other Rishonim did not. Right. So one of the reasons that earlier scholars questioned whether what version of the Yerushalmi the Rishonim had, and was it different? Did it have material that our Yerushalmi doesn't have, or was it missing material that our version of the Yerushalmi does have? All of that is because there are all sorts of places where you would think that if the Rif is interested in topic X and was writing about topic X, there is a Yerushalmi that is obviously relevant, and if he had the Yerushalmi, of course he would talk about it, and yet he does not. And the kind of stunning answer to that is the Rif, who is probably, since Rabbeinu Hananel and Rav Nissim Gaon sort of were never became central to Talmud, to later Talmud study, although they weren't forgotten. And the Sefer Mitivot, at some point, entirely, we don't have a copy of the Sefer Mitivot. We have references to it from early Rishonim, and segments of it that were quoted in some of those Rishonim, but Sefer Mitivot had clearly disappeared by 1200 or 1300 at the latest, and no copy of it survived. But the Rif didn't quote a Yerushalmi because his source was not the Yerushalmi itself, it was the Sefer Mitivot. And to a lesser extent, Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nissim, who were in fact his own teachers. And one of the reasons that the Rif is so committed to study of the Yerushalmi is that he studied with, or maybe he studied with the students of Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nissim in Kairouan before he fled Kairouan, first to Fez and then ultimately to Spain. So the tradition of prioritizing and giving the Yerushalmi a central place can be traced from Kairouan across and into Spain, and the Rif, go along with Rashi, were the two poles around which rabbinic scholarship in medieval Europe grew. Through the Rif, you had this 200 years of intense interest in the Yerushalmi. But the Rif himself generally did not have the Yerushalmi. He was consulting the Sefer Mitivot. And the reason we didn't know this is because we don't have the Sefer Mitivot. This was only reconstructed over time by cross-referencing things that the Rif quotes with quotes of the Sefer Mitivot that we have in other places. But what sort of demonstrates this, that the Rif was using the Mitivot and not the Yerushalmi itself, beyond a doubt, is that there are numbers of places where the Rif says, "Oh, in it's Katuv Yerushalmi," and quote something, which is not in a Yerushalmi. Again, one of the reasons people were like, "What?" The Rif must have a Yerushalmi with more material than ours does, or different material than ours does. And there are a few places where Zisman identified where you can see that the reason the Rif thinks that this text is from the Yerushalmi is because in the Sefer Mitivot, a passage starts, it's written in the Yerushalmi, and there's 2 lines from the Yerushalmi, followed by a quote of a Tosefta and either an explanation or a comment or maybe a line from the Bavli, where the Rif clearly understood that whole section to be Katuv Yerushalmi. Right? Katuv Yerushalmi, only 1 line, but the Rif thought that an entire passage was from the Yerushalmi. And in several cases, we can actually figure out that that he identifies something as Yerushalmi because of the way it was kind of presented in Sefer Mitivot. So that means is that in the 1520s, they were only able to make a printing of the Yerushalmi because they were able to find this one lone surviving manuscript that was written in the 1280s. The scribe who made that copy of the Yerushalmi in the 1280s himself was only able to make his copy of the Yerushalmi, that one that we have, because he found or was shown the only at that time surviving complete manuscript of the Yerushalmi that anyone knew about anywhere in the main in anywhere in kind of the rabbinic centers in southern Europe, and right, so that was from 200 years earlier. So already in the late 11th century in Europe, there was maybe there were 2 or 3 complete copies circulating, in a few different places, and only one survived until the late 13th, but not more than that, and possibly only that one was in existence for however long back, and that is because the main center of Yerushalmi study, and the reason there was such interest in it, was in Kairouan, and Kairouan was destroyed, clearly with however many copies of the Yerushalmi, of the written copies they had, destroyed with it. So to now sum up, to sort of retrace from the beginning of our story, Yerushalmi is completed in 400 CE in Israel. In what form was it completed? It is impossible to know. The Bavli, when it was completed, remained entirely exclusively oral. We know this. It was oral. It was memorized and orally transmitted. It was done on sort of not only it was sort of, they were ideologically committed to that until the Muslim conquest in the mid 8th century. Was the Yerushalmi similarly preserved only in oral form? It's hard to imagine, because even more than manuscripts, a text that was transmitted orally required a continuous tradition of its study and preservation, whereas a manuscript, something written, could have been written down, as evidenced by the manuscripts that we were talking about, could have been written down, left in a corner, essentially forgotten about for some extended period of time, and then rediscovered. That is very much more difficult with an orally transmitted text. But we don't know. Yerushalmi was completed. The material, either as a whole or in pieces, made its way to Bavel, and had this massive fundamental impact on the shaping of the Bavli. But that source text, the Yerushalmi itself, was essentially then forgotten about, and we have no traces of this text, no references to it, no allusions to it, no sign that anyone knew or acknowledged the existence of such a text for the rest of the Talmudic and Gaonic period until the 10th century. In the 10th century, we suddenly have first a few Gaonim mentioning in passing a line from the Yerushalmi, and then having to explain, oh, that quote is from this other text that you've never heard of called the Talmud Yerushalmi. Right, so the signs that the Yerushalmi was in some way, no idea how, in what form, I cannot tell you anything, but somehow rediscovered. This is again why it makes more sense to imagine that it was already in written form. It was rediscovered in the 10th century. Then this one student of the Gaonim in Babylonia, who wrote this book called Sefer Mitivot, in which, having now in the yeshiva newly rediscovered this Talmud Yerushalmi, the Sefer Mitivot goes through and systematically shows the extent of the parallels between the Yerushalmi and the Bavli just by laying out the texts side by side. Obviously, not all of them, but many. The Sefer Mitivot then passed that knowledge and that renewed interest onto his students, Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nisim, who both had traveled to Babylonia and studied in the Gaonic academies, but then came back and really, they were the first to establish a real center of rabbinic scholarship away from Bavel. They brought with them the Yerushalmi and an intense interest in it. They, like their teacher, the Sefer Mitivot, quote the Yerushalmi at length, regularly in their commentary on the Bavli. Stop and say, oh, but in the Yerushalmi, it says it differently. And they are, and they freely say when they find the Yerushalmi version makes more sense or they prefer it. That renewed interest in and sort of centralizing of the Yerushalmi as part of study of the Bavli is what leads in the next century Rabbeinu Hagaon to feel the need to declare that, oh, the Babylonian Amorim knew the Yerushalmi, and if there's a difference because they rejected the Yerushalmi's view, therefore we never follow the Yerushalmi when it conflicts with the Bavli. That's only necessary because of the Sefer Mitivot, Rabbeinu Hananel, Rabbeinu Nisim. And then, and Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nisim in Kairouan presumably had a copy or copies of the Yerushalmi. In Kairouan, they then taught much of that material to some of their students, and the interest in and knowledge and awareness of the Yerushalmi permeates the European communities, but not except for one or two copies, but not the written text. And therefore, once Kairouan is destroyed, there are a couple of maybe one, maybe a couple written texts, written copies of the Yerushalmi in all of Europe. All of the intense interest in this text over those 300 years is relying on occasional chance opportunities to consult one of those couple of Yerushalmi manuscripts, or in the actual large majority of cases, it seems, based on the quotes of Yerushalmi passages that they found in the Sefer Mitivot, which at the time they still had Rabbeinu Hananel and Rabbeinu Nisim. So the intense interest happened without manuscripts of the very text they were studying. And it is really, and then it was by the miracle and the vagaries of history that the scribe in the 1280s was commissioned to make a copy of that one manuscript, which he said was messy and fraying and in bad condition, and that manuscript, which then was the only surviving manuscript, was kept in remarkably good condition long enough to make it to the era of printing. And once it was a printed book, right? Then suddenly there are multiple copies, and we're having a whole different conversation. And it is only because of that, it is only because of that one surviving manuscript from the 11th century being copied into a single time into this manuscript in the 13th century. And that single manuscript surviving presumably in some monastery or some Christian theologian, Christian clergyman's collection until the 1500s, until the era of Hebrew printing, that any of the scholarship, any of the insight about the rabbinic literature that Yerushalmi offers, which is massive, was even possible.